I'm restoring my Jeep YJ frame, and instead of having it sandblasted, I wanted to chemically strip it, and I'm using the Clean Strip aircraft stripper. What I've done is take the gallon, pour some out into the tin, and then brush it on with the brush, wearing chemical resistant gloves. And so far I've put about 3/4 of a gallon on this frame, and the paint's already starting to fall off. So my plan now is to pressure wash the frame to take the rest of the paint off, flip over the frame, and then finish taking whatever's left off. But already, using about 3/4 of a gallon, the paint really is just falling off the side of the frame. And this is mostly factory paint, but it was in really good shape beforehand. So you can see the stripper takes it right down to bare metal quickly too. This has probably taken me about 25 minutes or so. But after this first application, there will be spots where the stripper didn't get all the way through to some of this paint, like at the base. So the idea is you clean it all off and then hit it again, and that'll give me my opportunity to flip the frame over and make sure I get the bottom really good. After all, right now it'd be easy to make the top look nice because this is what you see. However, once the Jeep's built, you really can't see the top of the frame, so it's important to make the bottom look the best as possible. So this is after 3/4 of a gallon of the Clean Strip paint stripper. Also, I did the cross member here as well. I'm going to power wash it, take another video, and then finish taking off the paint. Okay, I'm all done with the wire wheel, and I degreased the frame a couple times. I also sanded it with 100 and 120 grit sandpaper. And now that has left a really nice finish on the steel. And the finish on the steel is about the same as like a glass bead would be. Not quite as aggressive as some sandblasting, but since it's not sandblasted, I don't have to worry about contamination like in the pores of the metal. And I know now that the frame is very clean and ready for paint. And for paint, what I'm choosing to use is KBS Rust Seal. And there's a lot of information about this online, but it's a moisture cured urethane. And one of the main benefits to this type of paint is it's brushable. I have some experience with similar paints, and when it's all done with a brush, the finish is really, really nice. I thought about spraying the frame with epoxy primer and then a urethane top coat. However, I don't really have a booth. I didn't want to do this outside, and it's really tough to get into the small corners of this frame with a sprayer without making big runs. For example, to spray inside of this bracket here, the gun would have to be right here, and as you spray to get into this inside part, you're loading up the outside full of paint, and it's really easy to cause sags. But with a brush, you could take your time, do all the nooks and crannies, waste less material, and also have the added benefit, for me, of doing it indoors. So now that the frame is all degreased and ready to go, I'm going to apply this Rust Blast, which is a pre-paint primer. It causes zinc phosphate, I believe is what it is. It turns rust into some type of zinc phosphate coating. So put this on, let it sit for like 20 minutes, and then rinse it off. and we'll catch up then. I finished the rust blast, and here's the result on the frame. It basically looks like if you had new steel that was pickled, like cleaned and etched. This is what it looks like, and the dust doesn't come off. It's more like an oxidation on the metal. Some of the rust turned white, and some of the heavier rust is still a dark color. But I'm confident that that's clean. There's nothing coming off on that. So it is ready for paint. The bottle gave me about 20 minutes to cover the frame, and then I rinsed it off. So that portion of the project took about an hour start to finish. So now that it's dry, I'm ready to start the rust seal. And it's about 75 degrees in my garage and around 60% humidity. So it should be warm enough for the paint to flow real nice, but not too humid, so it has time to set up. And my plan is to do the bottom with all the hard to reach spots, then do the entire bottom face at the same time, flip it over, and then do the top and the other two sides, then let it sit, and then put the black top on. So the next step is the rust seal. All done with the KBS rust seal and blacktop coating. Came out pretty good. And this was all with a brush. So now I'm on to building the axles and installing all the suspension. You can see some spots where the paint ran a little bit, and I sanded it in between coats to try to make it as uniform as possible since I was using a brush. And then once I assemble everything, bless you, I'll touch up some spots that still need it. Right? Yeah. Ooh, yeah. I also use the KBS on the axles, which were a little bit more textured. And they're still drying actually, but they came out really well. One thing I'll say about the KBS is you have to be cognizant of the timing. So once you put the paint down, you don't want to touch it again, because what will happen, this is a good example, you'll actually get two different sheens. So on the right, I went over it real quick with a brush, and you could see it left a texture. And on the left, I didn't, and you can see a difference in the sheen, but this can all be blended together with a Scotch-Brite if I have to. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to put the chassis together. Some quick final thoughts about the KBS rust seal and black top paints I used. Now that it's been about a week since I painted the frame, I'd say everything is perfectly cured now, and this is as hard as it's going to get, and it is very hard. It doesn't scratch, it doesn't scuff, it doesn't chip, and I've been able to assemble everything without making any marks on the frame. So it does dry very hard. Some of the items I did mention in the previous video about the sheen, those did not go away as it cured. So be aware, if you're going to use a brush on a piece like this, you'd want to make one pass and then immediately pick up the wet edge and continue going on. Because if you let this dry, go do something else, and then come back to this, this is the type of result you'll have. Now, on the sides and the bottom where I had that, I actually scuffed it again with 120 grit paper and painted it with a new brush, and it does a really good job of sanding, and that extra coat really helps blend everything together. Now, this frame was reasonably straight with no heavy rust marks on it, and there was no scale, so you'd expect the frame to be nice and flat. And you can see the paint does a good job of flowing around the curves, and even inside all the cutouts, it made a good job of actually covering up all the holes inside the frame. Also, if you put the paint on thicker, it tends to dry a little bit glossier than the rest. So here's a good example. You can see my hand here, and this video is deceiving. It looks like it's high gloss, but it's really not. If you compare it to other places in the frame, this area is a little bit glossier because it went on a little thicker. And over here, this is actually more of a semi-gloss, which is what it's supposed to be. I know it's tough to tell in the video. It probably looks the same, but take my word for it. One excellent feature about this paint is it sands really well, which I was not expecting. I thought this would load up on the sandpaper and make sanding and blending a real nightmare, but just with regular sandpaper, it did a great job with the orbital sander to kind of touch up some spots, because you will have sags and drips if you use a brush. If I was going to do this all over again, I probably would have gone through the trouble to spray this with the KBS instead of brushing it, because by the time I touched up all the areas where it did run, I probably would have had just as much time in setting up some type of booth and spraying it. And if I was doing something that was where like accuracy was really important, I probably would steer away from this, just because it is really tough to make this finish perfect with brush. Something like epoxy primer would have been a better choice, like if this was a collector car or something like that. But since this is being built to be a daily driver for the most part in the summer, I know this paint is going to be good for that type of application. And then real quick, on the chassis, I built all the suspension with Old Man Emu parts, the shocks, springs. The steering is Rugged Ridge. Track bar is by MORE. The rear end is a Ford 8.8. And both rear ends have new gear sets in them, 355 ratio. And disc brakes in the back, new disc brakes in the front, all new ball joints, and everything throughout it's new. So I also am keeping the track bar, like I mentioned, from MORE, and I'm keeping the sway bar. And this is an aftermarket sway bar. It's actually 1 1/8 in diameter, so it'll be stiffer than stock. But since this thing will mainly be just on back roads where I live, I'm going to keep the sway bar and the track bar in the front, not in the back, because everything I've seen, track bar in the back really impedes the ride quality. But in the front, I can see why it would be necessary, so you don't have the axle move left to right as you turn and go over bumps. And new ball joints throughout, new U-joints in the axles. So really, as I build this chassis and suspension and driveline, it'll be a whole new Jeep. So if you have any questions about the KBS paints or how I went about this portion of the project, please let me know if you have any questions. And thanks for watching.